Trying to figure out what to be prepping next in times like these can be very overwhelming. So let's talk about what you should be prioritizing in your prepping right now. Hey everybody, it's Magic Prepper, and today we're talking about prioritizing your prepping right now. With everything going on around the world, I know a lot of people are new to preparedness or at least starting to get more prepared than they were before, and the whole concept can be very overwhelming at times. So for people who might be new to the game, as well as for people who have been in it for a while, this information is just to give you something to grasp onto and to look at and use to your advantage in the sense of taking your time and being a little bit more calm about the situation. Now, we do know there's a lot going on, so people have a reason to want to be a little bit more motivated right now. And if you want to stay motivated and be as prepared as you possibly can, then hit the subscribe button below, because hopefully the videos on this channel will help you do so here in the future. Now, prioritizing preps can be relatively easy, so let's not get carried away. There are some things you need 100% of the time, right? 100% of the time you're going to need water. So make sure you have some water storage. If you're not getting water stored up or having ways to get renewable water, then you are not going to find yourself alive for very long. And that is definitely something you should be looking into right now. Before you go out and get anything that's like an extra gear or anything that might be a little bit more niche, water is going to be a necessity no matter what happens. So water is one of the preps you need 100% of the time, no matter what. Moving on from that is going to be food. Obviously, food and water are huge, and if you have them, you're going to be better off than a lot of people post any disaster situation. You need as much food as you can possibly have, and water is very important as well, but without food, you will also die. So these are things that you need no matter what, 100% of the time. You need to focus on those as a priority no matter what else is going on around the world. And at the end of the day, you have to look at prepping as what will be used most likely. And most likely you're going to use water and food before anything else when it comes to preparedness. And that's just how it works, and that's just real life. But there are some things that you want to look into as well. These are just things you need 100% of the time no matter what. So if you don't have a decent amount of water stored or any food storage at all, you have to start there no matter what. And if you've been doing this for a while and you do have food and water stored, you have to take a look at it and say whether or not I have enough, or if it's sufficient for what I think may be occurring here in the world right now. Now, the other thing to look at is medication, because some people need medication 100% of the time. Not all of us do, but if you're one of the groups of people out there that relies on medication to stay alive, this is something you definitely need to look into right now and make sure you have as much as you can on hand in case the supply chain falls apart, in case something else happens in the world that restricts your ability to get more of that medication. That's going to be very important. And if you take medication daily, then it's something you probably need 100% of the time. I wanted to go ahead and mention that to make sure everybody was aware that that could be an issue for you depending on your situation. Now, another thing that we're assuming here in the sense of preparedness is that you have a form of shelter, because if you're prepping, generally you have a place to be putting these preps and to have all this equipment stored up and this food and this water and everything else. But if you don't have shelter, you need that 100% of the time as well. And some people could say, you know, your car could be a shelter if that's where you're living right now. Your Sprinter van or your apartment is a shelter, most definitely. Whatever you have that you're legally allowed to occupy is your shelter. So as long as you have some shelter, you're doing great. If you don't have shelter right now, and I don't know what your situation necessarily is when you're watching a video like this, but you don't even have shelter, either way, that should definitely be a priority. It's something you need 100% of the time. Now, that shelter might not be somewhere you can stay forever, and we all know that that's a possibility in the future, but you still need to have somewhere to be. So make sure that you have that figured out. Now, another thing you need 100% of the time is air. We all know that, and in general, we're gonna have access to air almost always, no matter what. But just keep in mind, when it comes to air, there are some things that can contaminate the air, which will eventually kill you if you aren't careful. So if you need things like a gas mask or a respirator or anything along those lines, you really need it. It's not just like a, hey, I'll just try to get by with my bandana or something like that. In the times that you need air to be clean and breathable, you really need it. So that's something to keep in mind. I'm not gonna say you need those items 100% of the time, because the likelihood of their use is extremely low. However, in that moment where you need it more than anything else that you own. So those are considerations to keep in mind, especially with everything going on in the world right now. Okay, now, my idea around this whole subject is that you need at least 2 weeks of food and water on hand. 2 weeks minimum. I mean, that is an extreme minimum. If you have 2 weeks of that stuff, you can at least start moving out into other parts of prepping that might actually enhance your ability to stay alive. And that 2 weeks is like a minimum threshold because a lot of things might maintain some level of civility for at least 2 weeks until things really blow up. So that being said, moving on to the other items that you need to prioritize right now, just in order to stay less overwhelmed and also more focused, are going to be things like emergency power. Now, I do want to say that you should be moving towards at least 3 months of food and water storage during this time while you're moving on to these additional preps. But these are the other preps that you need to definitely be prioritizing. Emergency power is huge. Having access to additional forms of power, if the grid goes down, is going to be a lifesaver in many ways. And you can get generators, either fuel, or you can get solar, or you can also get batteries and have just some form of power that you can utilize post a disaster scenario. Don't underestimate the ability for electronics to help lift you out of an emergency situation. Now, there are a lot of times where you could get by without any electronics forever. I mean, we've done it for thousands of years, right? But at the end of the day, in modern society, being able to have electronics available and using them to your advantage could definitely give you the edge. So emergency power is huge, and having that quality of life that it might provide could be very important as well. Fuel is also going to be important. Prioritizing fuel is a big deal, and as you can see right now with gas prices, having more fuel is going to be beneficial because it's only going to get more expensive most likely. Now, that being said, keep in mind that fuel is still a resource that cannot be renewed, whereas something like solar can. So these are considerations you have to make, but if you're using fuel and you have generators that require fuel, then you definitely need to be having enough of that fuel put away for those generators to actually help you in a situation. The other thing you want to prioritize right now is going to be kind of basic, but it's something a lot of people don't think about, especially people who might be like in apartments or something like that, is going to be hardware and tools. You want to be able to repair things or possibly fortify things or whatever it might be during a long-term disaster scenario. Don't rely on your landlord to come by and fix the hole in your wall or the broken window or whatever else it might be during a disaster. I mean, that's just not going to happen. So have ways to repair things yourself, especially when you talk about things like your vehicles. We all know how expensive vehicles are becoming. We all know how scarce they're becoming, and all the microchip shortages are causing the huge rise in price when it comes to used vehicles. And at the end of the day, being able to repair those vehicles and keep them up and running during a disaster could be a big difference in survival. So hardware and tools is always good to have, but a lot of people will find they actually don't have enough of it. So boxes of nails and screws and having the tools to actually use those items is going to be more important in a lot of ways than some of the other things we focus on in the preparedness community. And that's just real life, unfortunately. All right, because it's boring. So moving on from there, toiletries is another one you should be prepping right now. You can never have enough soap. You can never have enough shampoo. You can never have enough anything related to basic hygiene. Toothpaste, get a lot of it. Toothbrushes are really inexpensive. You should have a ton of them, because why not? Stuff like Q-tips even. Toiletries get overlooked because it's something that we kind of take for granted. We have it in our bathrooms all the time, ready to go, and whenever we go take a shower, we just use what we have, or we go to the store and get more of it if we run out. But you should have enough to get through a long-term event if those things don't ever rectify. And we find out that eventually down the road, you can't get more soap or toothpaste or anything else related to toiletries. So definitely prioritize toiletries right now, as those are things that you'll definitely want. You might not need them to survive per se, but keeping basic hygiene up can definitely keep you alive longer, as it gets rid of things that could cause you problems and sicknesses. But at the same time, it just makes for a good quality of life. Just something to keep in mind, okay? Moving on from there, you should definitely have first aid. Look, injuries happen no matter what, whether or not it's real regular life or it's fantastical SHTF or whatever else you want to call it. People are going to be injured at some point in time, and being able to treat those injuries is going to be huge. So make sure you have first aid squared away, at least a decent amount of it. You might want to look into things like Jace Medical. I know they're offering antibiotics for people now. I'm not affiliated with them, but I know that's the hot button right this second. And you might want to look into companies like Refuge Medical if you want first aid kits, who I am affiliated with. And if you use the code MAGIC on their website, you'll get 10% off your order. But either way, have ways to make yourself better during an injury, because there's not going to be a time where doctors are going to just make house calls if we're in the middle of a disaster. And if we're in the middle of a disaster, we also know that hospitals are going to be overflowing, and that basically if you're not on the edge of death, they're not going to treat you right away. So be able to treat yourself and understand that this first aid equipment is important. And if you had enough food and water but you don't have any first aid, then These are things you definitely need to be considering right this second. Another thing to talk about is obviously self-defense. Yes, I find it to be relatively important to have self-defense items around. People will get very desperate and very angry and possibly violent during a disaster scenario. And if you don't have a way to defend all this food and water and everything else that we've talked about, then you're going to have yourself a very bad time trying to keep all of the things that you need to sustain your life and sustain your quality of life. So, that being said, self-defense, a big one. Definitely have ways to defend yourself. I know not every country has access to all of the same equipment, but at the same time, keep in mind that you can defend yourself with a lot of different things. You just have to deal with what it is you're able to acquire, okay? Moving on from there, PPE, okay? Personal protective equipment can be very important. Now, why should we be prioritizing that? Well, obviously we know that over the last couple of years, we've seen the issues sprouting up when it comes to biological threats. We've seen the issues sprouting up now with nuclear threats and with everything else related to PPE. Have some on hand if you can. And right now, if you're worried about preparedness and you're thinking about what I should do concerning the situations going on around the world right now, I mean, I think that that is a relatively basic one. So get what you can when it comes to personal protective equipment and understand that these biological, nuclear, and possibly chemical threats in the future can only become more likely the longer all these events go on. So I think that it's something you should be prioritizing right now, and especially based on historical events, we know that this is a possibility. Now, moving on from there, clothes. A lot of people don't have enough clothes. When I say that, you should have like unopened bags of socks or underwear just ready to go in your house that you don't use right now. Have additional clothes that are like brand new and ready to go if things go down. If you have no access to, like, let's say a washing machine or a way to get your clothes clean, maybe you're in an apartment and the water shuts off and you're only relying on your storage water, you're not going to use that to wash clothes. So having new clothes can be a game changer, and especially clothes that wear out the fastest. And for me, that's socks and underwear. Maybe you have a different situation. Focus on what wears out the most for you, but at the end of the day, you're going to be glad you have more of that stuff, and it's going to be very practical in the sense of things that you are going to wish you had more of if a long-term situation ever arises, okay? Moving on from there, vitamins. Vitamins are huge. Maintain your health as best you can. Even if you can just invest in multivitamins, you're at least touching base on certain things that you might need. Vitamins are a big deal. They keep you healthy, and there's something you definitely want more of. And speaking of vitamins, keep in mind, you also want to make sure you have enough salt, okay? Hyponatremia is something that can set in when your sodium levels go too low and eventually can kill you. This is just something that's true. We need sodium in our bodies in order for our nervous system to work properly. So that being said, have some salt. Buy bulk salt and just have it ready to go. And if you find yourself in a situation where you're surviving off your garden or whatever else it might be, having that salt add additional sodium to those meals is going to be a big deal and will help maintain your health. Things to keep in mind, salt has a lot of other uses as well, as we know, in the sense of medical, as well as preservation when it comes to food. Something good to have, okay? Now, at the end of this, we're going to talk about just like if possible preps. If you have the possibility of doing these things, this might be something you want to look into. Gardening is huge. Not everybody has this possibility. Not everybody has property. Not everybody has a yard. Not everybody lives somewhere where they can just garden. So if you can't garden, I understand. Figure out a way that maybe you can. That would be helpful. But if not, don't worry about it. But if you can, you definitely should garden. You should definitely be working on that. And spring is right around the corner here, at least where I am. Maybe many of you are already in it, but at the end of the day, I'll be gardening here very soon for the same reasons that we're talking about right this second. Now, moving on from there, I would say having a bunker is not the worst idea. Now, a bunker could be anything from like a fortified basement to a storm shelter to a root cellar to whatever it might need to be, but if it meets the classification of being able to protect you during any kind of an event, I think a bunker would be a good thing to have at this point in time. And it's something I wish I could afford that I can't. But at the end of the day, if I had the ability to, I'd probably get one. So this is not just about having the property for a bunker, but also the financial access to be able to get one. I think it'd be a good idea. And then from there on, security and fortification would be another good thing. AKA if you can get cameras and then fortify your property and your home a little bit better. These are things that you should definitely look into. And when I say if possible, I mean a lot of people live in apartments and stuff like that and can only do so much, okay? Or maybe you live in a rental and can only do so much. So if you can, go for it and make sure you have the ability to secure yourself more properly. If not, it's not a big deal. Just see what you can do in order to adapt, okay, and get some other ideas and think outside of the box of how you can secure your living situation a little better without invasion of your lease or whatever else it might be that you might be violating, okay? I wanted to bring this up because a lot of people are asking in the comments and stuff of videos recently, like, what do we do? And like, what should I do in the sense of, should I spend this money on a solar generator or should I spend this money on a gas mask, right? People are wondering where to put their funds right now in the sense of prepping. And at the end of the day, the things that we talked about first, the food and the water and things like your daily medical needs or whatever else it might be, are still gonna be the most likely things you'll need and the most important. So I always wanna bring that to your attention. And if you don't have a decent enough amount of those items, then you're not going to get very far regardless of whether or not you have the solar generator or the gas mask. These are just basic concepts that we have to remember during these times of trouble that we're currently in. Wanted to bring this to your attention. Hopefully it gave you some things to think about. If you have anything else for me, just go to magicprepper.com or leave a comment below, and that's gonna be it for Magic Prepper.